Hey everybody, Alex here, and what we're going to talk about, I guess tonight now, is Age of Empires 2 and programming. More notably, the way we can duck together some crazy stuff and, as a programmer, try to do some interesting things that were never intended by the engine or the tools. It sounds a lot like JavaScript to me. I'm Alex, programmer, Ember, mobile Rails. If you do Ember projects, reach out to us at Isle of Code. Now that's done. So why am I talking about this? So I spent a lot of time playing Age of Empires 2 when I was younger. Perhaps I'm trying to justify that in some way. But I spent even longer just making custom maps all the time, and I did not know how to program yet. And looking back, as somebody who knows how to code now, it's fun just to think about how close I was to actually coding. I had this feeling when I was learning how to code of, I've seen this before, I know what I'm doing here. And like I said at the start, it's also fun as a programmer to look back and realize how absolutely ducked together this environment is. It's just hacks on hacks on hacks, but it's really impressive to see what people could pull off. So if you're not familiar, we're going to go through two quick sections at the start here. What is Age of Empires 2? I'll give you a crash course in the scenario editor before we get into some of the fun stuff. So if you've never seen Age of Empires 2, it's a real-time strategy game. Basically means we build up big armies, go fight other people. Came out in 99, the expansion came out in 2000, 20 years ago. That's how time works. It's scary. And the game cycle generally involves we collect resources with our villagers to recruit more villagers, and we use those villagers to get more resources to build buildings and ultimately raise an army and squash all the other players. If you're curious, this is just what the general game looks like, right? This is what most of your standard matches look like. You're just telling your villagers to go around, collect things. We're going to slowly raise an army and then, hopefully conquer the rest of the map. And that's single and multiplayer. What I want to talk about is that thing right in the middle, the map editor. This is where all of the fun that I used to have is. And the scenario editor the game came with was basic but powerful. It was really made towards building the standard maps like you saw. Because you're 8 and it's funny, maybe instead of fighting in a jungle, you fight on Antarctic ice with jungle trees because, LOL, that's great. It wasn't really meant to create these genre-breaking scenarios, but what happened is map makers learned how to string together these tools to create something even more custom, and because everybody was a kid and nobody had any money, that was better than buying a new game, and thus all these crazy mini games came up. Had nothing to do with Age of Empires, but we all played them in Age of Empires. And that led to a lot of really creative stuff, right? It went from a standard RTS game to blood and arena style matches. Capture the flags, we have to defend an area. Even these huge RPGs, like almost Baldur's Gate style, it would have cutscenes, player health, skill trees, gold. Right? There's no UI and no capability in the game or in the engine to present these, but people figured out how to do it. And perhaps most importantly, because it is the gold standard of television, people even made Survivor knockoffs inside of the game. I'm just going to say this really quickly, so I don't get flamed too much if this ever goes online. I know Age of Empires 2 is not the only game that ever had a really strong customization community. There's almost a lineage, especially with these RTS-style games, where it went, Age of Empires 2, StarCraft is in there, Warcraft 3 is in there. Certainly not the first, but it gave birth to MOBAs, right, with Dota and stuff like that, evolved as custom maps out of these games. And, this whole new genre came up. Today's equivalent to that, by the way, is Minecraft. If you have kids that are playing Minecraft, they're probably learning something that might help them 5 or 10 years from now if they're making custom worlds. And I say potentially, it's almost definitely Fortnite as well. It's a really interesting creative implementation there, and it goes super well. Now, last disclosure point before we get into the fun here. I am not the creator of a lot of the tricks I'm going to show you folks. I tried to track down the original creator because I was on all the forums 20 years ago and people were figuring this out. Unfortunately, a lot of those links are just dead and it was impossible. So apologies about that one. So what we're looking at here, we're getting to the fun part now. We're going to do a crash course in the editor to figure out what we can do. And all these tabs at the top, map terrain, players, victory conditions, these are if we're making a standard RTS map, right? We can put units, go and put all the trees where we want them and basically create a map. If we want to do anything custom, we do it in this triggers section. And you see we have triggers, conditions, and effects. So a trigger is just a grouping, right? And you'll see I've created a new one down the bottom here. We can give it a name and we can give it a description, which is basically a code comment. The rest of this stuff we're going to hand wave just for the purpose of tonight. Then you see what we can do is we can create conditions and we can create effects, right? So this is basically our world. So a condition might mean, player has an object in an area. There is a timer that's run, chance, somebody's being defeated, something is visible or invisible. And then we have our effects, which basically have an output on the game world. You might want to send a chat, play a sound, destroy a unit, create a unit, teleport or heal somebody, all types of things that we can do here. Now, if we think about this in programming, triggers are functions, right? They basically have a name and they group things together. In this case, a trigger is a grouping of conditions and effects, and a trigger can have multiple conditions and multiple effects. A condition is a standard conditional, like an if statement. And the way it works in this engine is all of the conditions in a trigger must be met before the effects will run. Then we have our effects that have an output in the game world. You might be thinking, that's rudimentary and that's a really ugly GUI. That's all we have. We have no way to do any of this in code. We must use the GUI to pull off some of the stuff I'm going to show you. Now, as a programmer, you might be thinking two things. Is there any abstraction? The answer is no, but we're going to come back to that in a second. The other thing you might be thinking is there a way a trigger can call another trigger? So I can at least have, my global stuff that doesn't impact something that might need custom variables. The answer is yes, but we don't call it a function calling another function. We were 8 to 10 years old at the time. So what we call them are trigger chains because we chain triggers together. It's really clever, huh? And in this case, let's just have a look at one. So for a trigger to call another trigger, you create an effect in that trigger whose job is to activate another trigger. And yes, you can create a recursive loop that will crash the game engine by doing this. Now, we have a real quick crash course, and hopefully that was not too quick for you, but I want to get to the fun stuff here, which with these tools, how can we design some stuff that never fit inside of this engine or inside of this environment? And the biggest example is an admin panel, right? Because it sounds a little bit like web, right? You build somebody a fantastic application, they ask how to administer it, and you're like, well, that was never in scope. That's a whole new piece of work. In this case, you'll often need to make an admin panel because it's multiplayer, somebody might be trolling and you need to kick them. Or, you might just want to troll your friends and make them be weaker than you. So that was never in scope, and that was definitely never in scope for this game or the engine. Again, there is no admin UI at all to do stuff like this. So how do we do that? What we do is we create an island on the map surrounded by water so no players can reach it. And we have a little unit just sitting in the middle here, which only the host, usually player one, has access to. And we basically move them around to do things. So in this case, you see his name is skeletons equals booter, walls equals gate killer. Then we have these different color flags up the top and down the bottom. And I'm sorry you can't see where I'm pointing. And what you do is you move your unit onto the colored flag that corresponds to the player who you would like to kick or destroy their walls. And this is how we administer the game, because there's no UI, so we have to figure out a way with the tools we have to make a UI. And this might not seem like much, but it's really impressive to me. Just another fun little consideration here, because I went through this all the time myself, is you might be wondering, why is this so far away from the game world? Well, gamers are trolls, especially prepubescent gamers. So what you need to do is put your admin panel far enough away from the game space or where players are playing that they can't destroy your admin unit with an archer and just destroy the match for everybody. So just so you can see this working, right? So we go through, we select our unit, and we just basically move him around, or her. In this case, doesn't really matter. And we're administering the game. Now, what you couldn't hear is that was playing. Age of Empires was playing at like 300% through my volume through my headphones, and that was quite challenging. But let's go and look at how this is constructed, right? So you see here, we're looking at triggers called booter, and we have player 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. So let's go back to that earlier question about abstraction. You can't pass variables in between triggers, and you must use the UI. So unfortunately, what that means is that if you want to make something that could potentially apply to player 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, or 8, then you need to go through and define a trigger with all of the separate conditions and effects for every single one of them. And yes, that does create as many bugs as you're probably expecting. It's a lot of work to pull this off, right? Because it was never built for this. And the other thing you might be seeing here is, looks like there's some code organization here, because we have booter and gate killer in red in all. So at least there's a way to group related triggers together. And there actually isn't. This is something that people who made maps just started to do, where you create an empty trigger, and because it's empty, it's invalid, and it goes red, and you put nothing inside it. And then you move that around so you can at least group your triggers in a way that this is manageable and easy to understand later. All right, so we're clicking through, we see that trigger is empty. And this is our only way to navigate the world, is with the mouse. And you see we're going through. So the way this is implemented, we're going to do that again just because it happened a little bit too quickly there. We've got player 2, and we see we have a condition that an object has been brought to an area, which is the flag. And then we have an effect that's going to destroy their gate. Right? And that's how the implementation of this admin panel works to destroy a gate. And yes, this has gone through and bound for every single player, just completely manual. All right, and just blowing those up in case you'd like to see them. So this is really complex, right? Or not complex, but somebody sat down and figured this out and has gone through and re-implemented this for 8 different players. Now, you might be thinking a lot of these are empty and you could maybe group some of these together. One of the challenges is that you often have to over-abstract your trigger chains because if you had more than 8 or 10 effects inside of a single trigger, it would crash the game for a lot of players, especially those playing on the potatoes that we had 20 years ago. So you often have to over-abstract and have all these basically small, I guess it was the precursor to microservice. We're already onto something 20 years ago and we're kids and didn't even know how programming worked. Now, we just saw basically a shoot together admin panel. And what was really funny is I was playing some Fortnite maps the other night, and in order to partner with another player, I had to do a similar technique where we'd run on top of colored flags and we'd group because there was no UI in that game. Let's talk about something else. Let's talk about timers. So we often want a timer in our game if we're building like an RPG and we want somebody to consume food, or in 5 minutes we want like a horde of enemies to show up. Now, the game does have a timer here, right, where we can implement a basic timer condition, which you would have seen earlier. It doesn't really work though, right? It's going to always loop, right? That timer is going to run nonstop through the game over and over and over and over again. Which is just an expensive operation. We could put some other conditions in front of it, but by doing that, we lose a run loop, right? We lose something that's running on a regular interval. So how do we implement a timer when we don't have the tools to implement a timer? The answer, and it's always the answer, is CDRAMs. So what we do, again, in the world space, away from where a player can see on a separate island or buried away, we create a CDRAM. People use different units for these. CDRAMs were popular in this game because they move slowly. And because they move slowly, you don't need to take up as much space with like your admin interface or your funhouse of weird things here. So we have a flag at the other side. And then what we do is we create, not necessarily grouped in the best way, but we start with, the first trigger, which is called reset timer. And, we have a condition that when there is an object in the area, so when there is a CDRAM on the flag, right? So when there is a single CDRAM on the flag, what we do is we remove any CDRAMs that are in the space where that flag is. Then we create a new CDRAM way back at the start. And then we tell that CDRAM to move to where the flag is. So now what we have is a recurring CDRAM that's going to spawn, drive to the flag, and it's always going to take the same amount of time, and then drop and respawn itself. Then we have basically our respawn function here, which will go through, it will create a new CDRAM, and it will tell it to go somewhere. And hooray, see this play, we now have a basic timer running inside of our app in a way that is optimized for the game engine, right? Running that timer as a condition makes no sense because the game engine can't do it, but it's absolutely optimized for a single CDRAM to be driving around like this. And now through trigger chains, we can make things happen when this time is run out. And we use a similar technique if we need to store state, right? So if we want a cutscene to happen based on things in the game world, what we do is we might put a king or a unit in a different position, and basically move them around a 4x4 or 6x6 grid and use that to represent state because we have no way to store state. So when we need to make a conditional based on world actions a player has taken, we go through and then look at the position of all the different units. So a custom map would often have 10, 15 plus, pawn states just completely hidden from the user and 12 siege rams just driving around in circles. So as an aside, and this was just really funny because it came up in my research, right? So you might be noticing, again, these are really, really complex, right? In the sense that we have to build all of these different triggers, conditions, and effects through the UI. But I saw this question, and it was a serious question. It was, how many triggers does my map need before I can brag about it? Because we're 12. And the answer is, it's considered poor form to brag about the number of triggers that your scenario has. But if you must do so, bear in mind that the top-rated campaigns have well over 1,000 triggers. It's not conditions and effects, that's triggers. So somebody by hand has put in, several thousand of these different things and just tried to make sure that they all work together. Now, because we put in all this hard work, we want to hide it, right? We don't want users to see all of our magic and, we protect these tricks. So we want to minify all the hard work that we've done. And, you might be seeing here, I'm just showing you Warriors Odyssey, which is this amazing custom map. But all these triggers, right, they're blank. We have no idea which one we're clicking into. And this is the best way we have to basically abstract from a user or somebody who's trying to reverse engineer our map. Now, how did they do that? Later, there were tools that would automate this on day one. What you did is you opened your file explorer, you copied the map for your published version. So just so you had a duplicate, then you would open the duplicate in the scenario editor and then click into every single trigger and delete the name. Because at least if you delete the name, it's really hard for another player to reconstruct what it is that you did, which is basically how minification works, or not basically, but it is equivalent to minification for what people were doing back then. It's just that we were insane, and instead of having a minifier that would make our code be of use for us and maybe give us some other benefits, we do that by hand over and over again. Now, these are all really fun tricks, but let's do one more just to end this that's really cool. So remember, this game is about spending resources to build a military. But people building custom maps like RPGs, where you might want to build the inverse. Maybe you want to consume food on a timer, and when that timer runs out, something dies or something happens. Or if we run out of gold, a bounty is placed on our head. So we need to constantly reduce a value on a timer, and if it drops below a certain value, we want to execute a trigger chain, right? We want to do something. So what we're looking for is some type of an observer or wild truth statement. As a programmer, we know we want that, but there's no way in the engine. So how do we do that? We have the timer. How do we do the rest of that? Well, the answer, or the observer, is harder, and the answer, as always, is siege rams. We're just going to make a little modification to our siege ram script here. Right, so we have our standard timer one run that we were talking about before. And you see just in the bottom right section here, and I just need to move the laptop a bit so I can see my own screen. Perfect. Sorry about that. Small technical difficulty. Accumulate attribute, right? So what we're going to do is we're saying that the food stockpile has at least one. So this is a condition, right? Does the player have at least one food? So we're making an exception to our little timer loop whereby, sorry, my Mac does not like running Loom and all these videos together. And we're going to do that on the large flag that you see first. So if the player has at least one food, our timer loop is going to run as it did before. Now what we're going to do is create a new trigger called Hunger Death. We're going to put that on the very last flag. And if the siege ram ever hits that flag, in this case, what we're going to do is just declare victory for the next player, right? Or for the computer or whoever you're competing against. So functionally, what we've managed to do is extend that timer that we built before into, into an observer, basically, under which the siege ram is always going to drive to that first flag. The player has at least the amount of resources we require. It's going to respawn and never hit that second flag. Whenever it does hit that second flag, it's going to destroy, and we know some condition has been met. So we've managed to implement an observer here. And basically, what ends up happening is we're building a custom map and we end up having, 4 or 6 different pawn grids and a whole funhouse of just different siege rams surrounded by gates that are there to manage game state. And that's basically how we end up managing state and, designing all these different, abstractions into an engine that was never ever built to support them. And we really end up in an environment where we have hacks on hacks on hacks. So thank you very much. Hopefully that was fun for you. Had tangentially related to programming, I guess, but it's fun to talk about. As a programmer, it's just fun to look back and see some of the crazy stuff we were doing. At this point, I think I'm hanging around to see if anybody has any questions. Thank you very much.
And here we are. Hey, Alex.
Hey.
Thanks for your talk, man. So one thing I want to do with Ken Wheeler that I forgot to do that you get to do instead is a tongue twister. So there's this new ECMAScript 2020 API called knowledge coalescing. I'd like you to say it 5 times as fast as you can.
Okay, I'm going to do my best here. And
All right.
warn you, I'm either maybe a little bit more here, but let's go. Knowledge coalescing, knowledge coalescing, knowledge coalescing, knowledge coalescing, knowledge coalescing.
It turned into like knowledge coalescing. That's awesome.
I'm Australian. That's what we do. You just butcher the vowels in the middle.
Right.
As long as the start and the end comes out fine, you're good.
Well, in New Zealand, they just drop 80% of the letters. So it'd be like Nulco. And you'd be like, what is that?
You said it, not me, but you're not wrong.
I know. I was there and they're like, you're a ginga. And I'm like, what? A ginger. Oh, okay. All right, cool. Yeah. Anyway, sorry, Kiwi friends. Yeah. So I have a question for you. Like, how did you come up with this talk idea? Like, especially if I think our audience might be like, that's a really cool talk, but how did you even decide to talk about this? And how would I make a talk like this, right?
Yeah, so I guess there are kind of 2 elements to that, right? I'll talk about how I got this at HalfStack, but I've done a couple other programming talks before. I spend a lot of time, writing guides and things, but it's all about what I do professionally, which is, Ember, mobile, things like that. But it's not necessarily just the only thing you find fun or the thing you find most fun at times in programming. So for me, this is one of those memories I'd had where I was getting more technical, but I wasn't yet a programmer and I didn't really fully understand what I was doing. Then, I kind of wanted to learn how to code. I couldn't figure it out because I was a kid and just whatever reasons. But looking back, you're like, crap, I was actually really close. And a lot of the things I was doing was like maybe just using this really like GUI on top of very similar concepts. So it's one of those things where looking back, you're just like, I was so close. And when I was learning, in a few ways, it helped me because I had a different frame to some of the same solutions I was seeing, right? When we were talking about observers, like I legitimately did see a siege ram the first time I learned about observers. And I'm like, yeah, I know exactly what we're doing here conceptually. And then I remember, I think it was at All Things Open down in Raleigh, Carolina. I forget.
Yeah, North Carolina.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's right. I remember I met you and we got chatting. I don't remember if it was at that conference or another one where we were both doing talks. And I remember just mentioning this to you. Very immediately, like this is perfect for HalfStack.
Yep.
Right. It's
exactly.
one of those wonderful developer passion projects that is tangentially relevant, maybe, but
yeah, it's interesting. I generally make a decision, yes or no, on a talk for HalfStack in about 30 seconds. And it's pretty rare that it's like maybe. It's usually, yes, that's for HalfStack, or no, that's not right for HalfStack. And it's pretty quick. Like you hear something you've never heard before that's interesting or hacky or just a creative story, and that's kind of what this whole event is about. So yeah, makes sense.
No, it's great fun, and it was also one of those things. I remember when I was younger, right? And like any kid, your friends like, why are you spending so much time on the computer? Like, is this productive? You're playing games the whole time. So like parents, if your kids are playing games, there may be productive ways they could be doing it at the very least.
Exactly. Yeah. I remember typing in like, I had the Commodore 64 and they'd have like the books of hexadecimal code that you could enter, and you'd make a mistake and like it would just fall apart. It was great. It was fun. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I spent so long just like moving trees and doing things that made no sense, but just building that was so enjoyable, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I know you work with Ember a lot. I actually haven't had much time to look at Ember Octane, so maybe give me the like 10,000 foot level of what's new with that whole setup.
Yeah, so for those who are not familiar, Octane is kind of a big new release of Ember. It's a new version, but it's not really a v3 or anything like that, right? And it's almost a accumulation. I don't know how to say that word properly. of a lot of threads that have been running for a long time. And I take no credit for this. I am not one of the people who did any of the work on Octane at all. I don't want to pretend. But it cleans up a lot of the syntax, right? We're finally able to use your standard dot syntax instead of having, string getters and setters all over the place as an example. And there are a lot of just architecture cleanups in the application, which, if you're following better practice prior in Ember, you're probably implementing, but maybe weren't necessarily standard the framework yet. So it's almost like a standards refresh at the same time.
There's definitely Ember used to have a lot of things it had done before. I mean, Dojo had the same problem where ECMAScript didn't do these things yet. You had to come up with your own way. Now it does them. How do you unwind all the deviations you had from the now different standard and then still keep applications working? Because Ember's always been really big into like, we will not break you. You will have a migration path. You will. Is it more challenging with this big change, or is it a fairly straightforward path forward?
Yeah, so I certainly won't pretend it's as simple as a minor version upgrade, but the same spirit is being kept where the upgrade path is clean and well understood. So there may be points where you have to put in a little bit of work, but one of the critical things here is you can still use your old school getters and setters, and there are ways to progressively import some older APIs you're maybe using.
Sure.
So you can also piecemeal a migration, but one of the nice things about Ember, and I know there's some similarities with Dojo as well, is that it's an incredibly structured approach to what you're doing, which means a lot of that migration work is understood up front and you can plan for it.
Right.
But in all honesty, we've taken quite a few older Ember apps and the upgrade process was simple. For the more vanilla apps, it was actually automated, right? People had built these third-party add-ons that would actually just migrate a lot of the code for us.
Yep. So, what interests you like on a hobby or side project type of stuff? Like, what do you think you might work on next? Or no idea is totally a good answer too, of course.
Yes, well, I mean, classic video gamer thing, probably who learned how to program. But after the Age of Empires talk, I started picking up Unity again. And there's not a project I am trying to make at all. I'm not pretending that, but it's a fun progression from having spent so long in map editors. And it's been fun because I don't pretend I really understood much of how anything to do with physics works or even just the 3D programming. So I've been learning a lot just getting this basic RTS style thing running. I've had to learn what a raycasting is and how does that work. And I've been making my own little models in Blender that are low poly. So it's just been a really fun process to understand all the work that goes into that. And what I think's been most interesting is last week I had to sit down with a friend who works on 3D all the time and just say hey man, I'm a good enough programmer otherwise. So I've just brute forced my way to this point and I have no idea what I'm doing. And he had to sit down with me and just call out all of the anti-patterns in my work that I just gotten away with.
That's amazing. That's pretty much me with my own code all the time. I'm just like, oh no, that's sad. Why did I do it that way?
Yeah, it got to a point where I had my own hash table in memory to manage a grid system just because I'd never bothered to learn how Unity planes work. I was just why bother?
That's awesome. We have, I guess this is a question I've asked everyone, and you don't have to answer if you don't want to, but so how has the whole COVID-19 stay-at-home stuff impacted you personally? Is it work different? Are you working more? Are you having more time to code? What are you doing?
It was definitely an interesting transition for the first couple of weeks. Probably like everybody, I had some relationship changes, all types of things happening at once there. But company-wise, we've been running and working full-time, and that is good because you're kind of kept busy through the day. Right. Going fully remote was new to us, but we were remote a couple of days a week. So process-wise, not a huge change there. We're otherwise still working. And hobby-wise, I've really just had more time to, play Unity, do a lot of cooking, spend more time teaching this little guy who's helping me on the lab here. He's looking that he doesn't want to. And I hate to admit, I've been playing a lot of Fortnite lately. As an adult, I'm this is the only time I'm going to sit down and play this many video games, and maybe I should. So I feel compared to a lot of people, I've been very lucky through this. It's set up and still going.
That's cool. Well, I think it's about time. Thanks for making the time. Thanks for the great presentation. And up next is Pentelis. So we're going to go ahead too. Thanks. Bye, Alex.
Thank you.